Hello everyone, and welcome to the iSpring Solutions webinar series, where every week we talk about e-learning trends, share iSpring tips and tricks, and cover clients' cases. My name is Paulina. I am the community manager at iSpring, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. And during this last session of 2019, we will be talking about using storytelling strategies to write compelling scenarios. And I think this is a beautiful topic to wrap up the very productive year of 2019. And our presenter today is Hadiya Nuruddin. Hi Hadiya, how are you doing? Thanks for
I'm
tuning in.
great. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So Hadiya is a great presenter and actually author of the book Story Training, Selecting and Shaping Stories That Connect. And today she will be more than happy to share her wisdom and experience with you guys. And before I pass the mic over to you, I will just cover a couple of more technical things. So first of all, this session is being recorded, so no worries. You guys will receive a link to a replay sometime after the webinar. However, I would like to encourage you to stay till the very end because it's a great and wonderful opportunity to address your questions directly to our presenter. And to do so, please submit them in the question box, which you should find on the right side of the GoToWebinar panel. So it should be somewhere at the bottom, and right now on the screen you should see what it looks like. Okay, so I think it's time for us to rock and roll, and Hadiya, I would like to pass the mic over to you as well as the presenter rights.
Thank you. So it is such a pleasure and honor to be here. I'm very excited to be the last session of 2019. It's been an incredible year for me. I hope you enjoyed the year as well. It went by really, really fast, although December seems to be going by really, really slow. I don't quite understand that. But I'm excited to be here nonetheless. So I first want to introduce you to this topic by telling you something that may be quite shocking. So I hope you're sitting down for this. So, what if I told you that right this very second, right now, you are in the middle of a scenario? You're in a scenario. What if I told you that that scenario started when you woke up this morning? Or better yet, this scenario started when you began your professional work life. And I say that sounds facetiously, but not really. I had to really begin to change my approach to writing scenarios when I started realizing that they were life. This scenario, this story isn't separate from what people would be experiencing day to day on the job and how they are playing out different aspects of their work. Because initially it was a separate thing for me. It was my SME would tell me a story and I would change the name and there's your scenario. It would be, I approached it more like a word problem rather than a snippet of life, a snippet of what people are experiencing day to day. As instructional designers, I don't know how many of you are that, but as instructional designers, there's a bunch of magical skills we're supposed to have. I call them magical skills that people get full on degrees in, like full on master. But we're supposed to know them just off the top of our heads. Why not? You know how to market, right? You know how to edit audio and be a voiceover artist. So we all know, we all feel that pressure to be all of those things. But I'm going to add another thing on that pile, and that's documentary filmmaker. Like that, take it that seriously, that you are walking into people's life, helping them make sense of it a little bit, or having them tell their story. And then you need to back out of it, right? You're back out of it and you actually go and you communicate their story to the world, right? So keep that in mind as we talk about this. I'm trying to break out of that idea that that scenarios are just word problems and are just little situations, but they're life. And it's an awesome responsibility for us to take that more seriously and tell people's stories so that their voice can be heard. All right. So, as was mentioned earlier, my name is Hadiya Nuruddin. I've been in learning and development for about 20 years and been focusing a lot on e-learning for the last 10 or so, um, 10, 15 or so. I work for myself. I'm a learning strategist because I work for myself and I can call myself whatever I'd like. And I'm also an instructional designer, e-learning developer, and I speak at a lot of different conferences. But I am the author of a book called Story Training, and that's how I got really interested in taking scenarios more seriously. When I started doing the research for this book and focusing a lot on storytelling, it really helped me bring stories to life and think, how can I actually apply all of this great stuff I'm learning about stories to scenarios? Because sometimes I think we don't make that connection strong enough. Okay, so I only have one goal for this. We don't have that much time together. I just have one goal. I just want you to consider storytelling techniques when you write scenarios. Again, these are, some techniques and some thoughts that authors have been thinking about for decades and decades, but yet, it's something that we sort of step into and are not really sure how to pull it off. How to make a scenario so that people really care about the characters. One thing I want to mention about stories in general is that sometimes I believe that we feel like a story is inherently an experience that people want to invest in. Just hearing a story is something that people will be moved by, it will evoke emotion, but that's not true. You have to write the story to do that. You have to make the story matter. You have to introduce real consequences and real meaning and real feeling, and more than anything else, you're not just telling a story to tell it, you are trying to make the learner see themselves reflected in the characters that you build. You want your learners to feel empathy for those characters. Like, I feel Carol's journey. I know what she's going through. I've been through that myself. So that's the point. The point of telling stories and scenarios is to mirror the learner's experience so that they can feel like, yeah, I can see the stakes here. I see what's at risk. I see what's important. And now I'm invested in this character being able to get to where they need to get, because guess what? I have to do that too, and maybe I can learn something from this. Okay, so I'm going to have you do a little exercise here, and it's going to require some reading on the screen, so we're going to take some time to do that. But obviously, I want you to read two scenarios, and what we have here is a situation between these two people. The person on the person labeled number 2, she is the manager of the person labeled number 1. There's a scenario here around delivering feedback, and I want you to read both of them. They are the same scenario from two different points of view, but that's not the relevant thing. What's relevant is how both of these scenarios attack storytelling and how they make you feel when you read them. So it's not so much that perspective that matters, it's how those perspectives are presented to you that matters. All right. And then what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to ask you to tell me in the question box, what do you see as the differences? Don't overthink it. Just as you're reading it, what did the different ones make you feel? What do they make you think? And I'm going to go to that now. So these are the two. Go ahead, take some time, read them. In the question box, I'm going to keep an eye on that. And I want to get a sense of what do you think the differences are?
So we
Okay, I
have,
see them one here.
mhm.
Number 2 is showing rather than telling. I like the feelings. Gives us gives us more information. And one thing I want to note about these two is one thing that we're always concerned about, or why we may shy away from scenarios, is that we think it's going to be too long. It's going to take too much time. Yes, scenario 2 is a little bit longer, but not much longer. It may be about 15 words longer. It's not that much. Sounds more like an actual story, yeah. So I want to point out, yeah, the dialogue is more specific, more realistic. So I want to point out, and of course, it seems like I'm leading the witness a little bit by making giving one dialogue, but I do have a couple of people who definitely prefer the first one. They feel like it gets straight to the point, and they like that style, and they don't want to get too involved in what's going on. But let me just point out some of the differences between the two. One is, of course, the dialogue, and dialogue is not just a, hey, I wrote dialogue. One of the reasons why one of the reasons why dialogue is so meaningful is that it gives you insight into how people are. I mean, it's just like seeing a person from across the room and thinking one thing, and then going to talk to them and thinking something completely different after you have that conversation with them. Dialogue serves the same purpose as it serves in any scenario, in that it gives you insight into people's personality. Sometimes it's what they don't say that matters. So dialogue can be very, very revealing. And just because you're in an e-learning scenario, that doesn't change. People still feel that. People still want to hear what's going on in people's heads. So that's one function of dialogue. It lets you convey a lot more rather than describing exactly how he is. By the way he says things, what he says, what he doesn't say, gives you a little bit more insight into that. Another thing here is that this first one, you're out of the situation. You're sort of hovering above it. With the second one, you're there. You're in the room. And just a simple change of language of Beth is attending a meeting. Right there, you're in the room. Is attending, you're in the room. Right there. There's a couple of other things. The two words that always stand out to me is Beth cringes. As soon as I read that, I cringe too. I feel that, ooh, I feel a little, shiver of, oh, wow. So I automatically am starting to feel a little bit of empathy for her and put myself into her shoes. Another thing about this that borrows from storytelling is the idea of stakes. Right? That's one thing that's interesting, right? Because we can see there's something at stake for Beth here. And what's at stake is that idea that she doesn't like confrontation. You say that up front. And the fact that if you now put her in a situation where she has to confront someone, that's going to cause a change in her. That's something that she is worried about, and it's a risk. So now we're putting things at stake. So the point of this, of course, is just that in just a few more words, by using a few techniques that have been used in novels and movies for years and years and years, you can make people get connected and feel empathy towards the characters that you're focusing on. Someone said, I dislike David. Yeah, I have had a couple of people who are very much team David. They're like, he's not that bad. Everyone needs to just calm down. We're too sensitive. So yeah, you never know, and I think that's an important note as well when it comes to storytelling in general, and it carries over to scenarios. People aren't really hearing what you're saying or reading what you're writing. They're filtering it through their own experience. Right? So you may think, oh, this is an easy one. Of course, you're going to pick scenario one. And then people filter into their own experience with scenarios, with work, and with all of that. That's your intent. This really easy question that you thought that you were actually loading the deck with actually is not at all what they were thinking or come away from. So that's uh that's something that happens too with scenarios. And you can't clarify with e-learning, right? I mean, you have to keep it moving. So we're going to talk about 5 of these techniques, and 5 things to consider as you think about creating your scenarios using storytelling techniques. The first one, go back to that. The first one is use scenarios wisely. So there are times in which people feel like, oh, well, I shouldn't use a scenario for that. I can't write a scenario for that. Can you give me in the question just a few little ideas there, or some thoughts of what type of subject matter do you think storytelling works is best for? Or what have you used them for in the past? Soft skills, that's a common one. Any interpersonal relationships, I get that a lot. Sales, HR. Yeah, when people have to make decisions. And I think that one reason why it works so well for those situations is that human beings are the ultimate variable. And anytime you have to deal with the variables, with things of changing, where you have to expect the unexpected, who better to present the unexpected than a person? Right? So that's one of the reasons why we drift in that direction. A lot of people shy away from them, from technical skills. I see one person here wrote technical training, and I totally agree with that, because it's, you're not training the computer, you're training the person using the computer. And anytime people are involved, you have some scenarios, you have something there. So I argue that there's always a scenario. Always. You can't say there's no scenario. Always a scenario, because as long as there's a person involved, there's a scenario there. The question is, how do you get it? And whether or not it's realistic and you can make it come to life in the confines of the e-learning environment, however you choose to see those. But there's some recommendations on when to use scenarios and how to use them wisely. So scenarios are best used when critical thinking is required to complete a task, right? So it is one of those things where you can use them in nearly any environment, but sometimes it's not worth the time. Sometimes, because they take a lot of time to make, they take a lot of time to support. You have to come up with all those, not just right or wrong, but the nuancing of the message. But anytime critical thinking is involved to complete a task, it's one of those that's um, ripe for storytelling. So strategy topics, interpersonal skills, someone mentioned that, diagnostics, technical training, something to that effect, trade-offs. I always say there's no right or wrong, just consequence, right? So if you make one decision, what are the implications of that decision when you go in another direction? So scenarios are great for something like that. Scenarios are really good for something where there is no right or wrong, even though our learners tend to not like that. They just want the right answer. However, scenarios are great for saying, again, there's no right or wrong here. There's just an outcome, and you have to look at what that outcome is and whether or not it's one you want, and not just thinking about the outcome, the effect on you, but the effect on everybody else involved. Variability, we talked about that, whether there's many considerations, things are always changing, the variables influence the outcome. And again, humans always are great about introducing variables and variety and things that can change. And then stakes. If something is risky, when I did a class for ATD once, and it was at the CIA building. And of course, I'm teaching, and as I was doing a live class, I'm like, hey, have you ever had any training that you had to develop that was about a risky situation? Of course, not really a good question, because they train agents for the CIA. Obviously they do, but they couldn't tell me anything. They couldn't really participate, because I didn't have clearance, so I was kind of just talking to myself the whole time, without being able to get much insight into what they were doing. So it's a great memory. So rarely high risk, and something, if the stakes are meaningful, that there can be something lost, and it doesn't have to be a physical thing. It can be an idea around people's identity. I've learned, you mess with people's identities, their self identity of how they see themselves, they don't like that very much. So anytime you put something at risk where people are forced to look at themselves and maybe reassess who they are and how they take up space in this world, that's risky. That's risky. So scenarios are great for something like that. People often say also too, scenarios are good if there's only one way to do something. I argue there's always two ways to do something. It's just one of them is wrong, right? There's always a way that someone can go the wrong direction when you need them to go in one specific one. All right, the second one here is probably the hardest part. I know it was for me, and that's getting the real story. I mean, I can't make this up in my head. I mean, some of you may be in a situation where you perhaps um, are training on a topic that you know very well, that you used to live this topic. But I wouldn't always just run with that and assume you know exactly what's going on now. I mean, I started my career in tech support, but I couldn't, it wouldn't be very interesting for me to tell stories about Windows 95. Obviously, the world has moved on and there's different experiences that they're having. So I would definitely consider, how can I talk to people who are actually living this and get their perspectives. So there's a couple of techniques here. One, ask. Again, sounds really simple, but I can say that sometimes you don't ask, and that you don't have access to these people. You have to really stress, it's important that I'm able to talk to people. I call it, I'm often manager blocked, where the manager won't let me get to the actual people I need to talk to. I'm like, Fred's standing right behind you. Like, no, he isn't. So I'm not able to get real access to the people I need to talk to, but as much as I can, ask and try to get some insight into, how are you encountering this topic? What does life look like in this topic? It's important. Interview. That's skill number 625 you as an instructional designer are supposed to have and have mastered to get to the truth. And there's interviewing and getting good information out of people is a problem that was already solved in other industries like journalism. Um, However, for us, trying to get to the heart of the story is sometimes difficult. And I'll talk about a technique on how to do that in just a second. One is observe. Sometimes you get the ability to watch people do the work. And the other one I call strategic story sharing, which is a part of interviewing. So for me, strategic story sharing is this idea of building rapport. I'm a consultant. I show up out of nowhere and I'm asking people for all of this information. And they don't know me from Adam, but I'm getting all this information from them because I have to in order to build the scenario. So in order to build the rapport, what I do is I tell my story to them, and they usually respond by giving me their story. It's not just this even exchange, it's just by telling your stories, you are creating an environment where it says it's okay to be honest. Another strategy, reason why this works really well, is because people may not want to give you information, but they're so happy to correct you. So if you have experience in retail and you're doing training for retail, and you can say, okay, well, there was a time where I worked in retail and we did this and we did this. Is that very similar? And if it's not, they'll say, no, it's different here. And you say, how so? Sharing your stories help listeners, that helps them connect to you, and that now you're just having a conversation. It doesn't feel like an interview. But if you go in there just expecting them to reveal themselves and you're not reciprocating, then it just becomes very one-sided, and it feels like they're being interrogated rather than you're having a discussion with them. Once listeners feel more connected, they're more likely to share their stories. And sharing stories leads to trust and rapport, but most importantly, answers. You're not there to make friends. Maybe you are, I don't know. However, the point of this is to get the answers that you're looking for. And if you're able to share a little bit of yourself, that's an important thing to do. But again, the point is a technique to get them to open up and be able to say, yeah, it's similar to that, but not exactly. 3, there's a scenario design model that I'd like to introduce you to if you have not seen it already. And this actually, um, this was animated at some point, but now it's not. That's fine. What this is, if you can see this section here behind it, where you have a couple of steps here. One is the task. And well, let me introduce it to you first. First, let me say that this is not mine. This was created by Ruth Clark, and her entire book of scenario-based e-learning is this model. I also teach a class for ATD based on this model. So that's what this is. And what's nice about it is that it actually, what's nice about it is that it serves almost as a checklist for my scenarios. It's like a recipe. So when I look at my scenarios, I'm able to see whether or not they have all the parts they need. But also, too, you can actually just create a template that's a table that has each one of these components, and you write your information in that template. And then later you can nuance it, of course, but this makes sure that you're not just adding words to add them, that you have all the information that you need. So let me introduce you to this. So first you start with the task, as we always do. We know the task deliverable is that objective. So what's the point of this scenario? What are you trying to get to? Then there's the trigger event. So this trigger event is who or what initiates the scenario. Sometimes the hardest part of the scenario is getting people in the room. What's realistic? I was putting a class together for delivering feedback, and I had all these scenarios where people were talking face to face. I learned later that no one talks face to face. They are in an environment where they're always talking on the phone, or more than likely talking on the phone. So that sort of, even though well, it's different. It's different delivering feedback face to face and over the phone. So that kind of throws those out the window. I had to rewrite them so that how do you give feedback in absence of body language? Next is case data. So this is what's supporting the context. And this is hard too. This is when we get wordy because we feel like how much information do they need in order to meet this objective, right? So this is the information about their relationship. And we're going to look at that scenario that we looked at, and I'm going to show you examples of these, or you're going to tell me where the examples are. And what is their relationship? How long have they known each other? Is this a problem that's happened before? Has she attended the meeting before? Has she talked to him already about the way he talks to people? How much case data you add is up to you, but it can be tricky because you don't want to add too much. You want to add just enough to make sure that people can meet that objective. Next is guidance. Who or what is here to help? What information is here to help? And what are the learner responses to action? Sometimes it's you got this right, you got this wrong. Sometimes it's the consequence. Oh, now that you've said this, this is going to happen. And then this is something we rarely do in e-learning. I guess I should only speak for myself and what I've seen, but I don't see reflection very often, just that opportunity to stop and go, wait a minute, what's happening here? In the class that I teach for scenario-based e-learning, for ATD, there is an example that we show, and it's an old example. I mean, it is just straight up HTML and links. So it isn't, you don't need fancy graphics to do this. But what it is a doctor who has a patient who in his living will wrote that if life can no longer be sustained for him, to take him off life support. The doctor has to now go to the wife and say, hey, your husband has this living will that says that he does not want to be on life support. Um, and we're in that situation now. What do you want me to do? The wife says, do not take him off life support. That is murder. I will not have that happening, right? However, the doctor knows she has to make this decision because she has a living will, and then she has the needs of the wife. So what it does is it has you have it actually walks you through talking to all of these coaches. You can talk to a lawyer, you can talk to a priest, you can talk to whoever you want to talk to, and you talk to a lawyer. She chooses a lawyer and she looks at state by state of what's going on and what she needs to do. So finally, she makes her decision. In this scenario, she makes a decision to take him off life support. Then it says, wait, stop. Are you sure? Are you sure? And it makes you reflect and go, oh, no, I don't know. And so it teaches you to look up other things as well. Have you considered this? You looked at the data, and that's great. Now I want you to consider a couple of other things. And so that's just HTML. It's just really, really simple, but it's one of the greatest examples I've seen of stop, wait a minute. And it's teaching you to do that. It's teaching you not to make decisions willy-nilly. Okay, so what I'd like you to do, and I know it's hard to look at the screen here, but what I'd like you to do is take a look at that scenario again. And that should say accept feedback. Sorry, typo. So I want you to I'm just going to look at for a few of them, whatever you can find in here. I want you to point out in the questions, and then we're going to talk about them, right? So here is that model. It's up in the upper right-hand corner here, the trigger event, case data, all of that. And I want to know from you in the questions, what do you think is the trigger event? There's actually two in here. There can be multiple ones. Let me know in the question, what's one of those trigger events? Beth cringes. Okay. What else? Conflict resolution, feedback. David, let's get started. Beth attends the meeting. Yeah, that's a popular answer. Just her being in the room. That's one of the triggers. What's another trigger? Another trigger one says conflict resolution. The fact that she even decided to be there, something must have happened. There's a reason she has to be there. So that's a trigger. And then her being in the room, and then someone said, David, David saying, let's get started. That's a trigger event as well. So there's a couple of different ones. So someone put complaints. Yeah, that's the nature of why she's there. Why did she walk into the room? It's writers spend a lot of time on this stuff, a lot of time on how to set up a scene. Is it realistic that she would go to that meeting? Is a question you would have to confirm with your subject matter experts. Is that a behavior that we want to support? And this supports the behavior that you need to go see for yourself in certain circumstances. Is that the type of behavior we want to teach? Right, so those trigger events can get a little complicated. Give me an example of case data. What's one example of case data that you can find in here? So it's just something that supports the context and supports the story itself. Something that they need in order to answer the questions that you're giving them. The quote, yeah. So the dialogue is case data. Yep. Yeah, that's a big one there. While David has more seniority than her, I had a person in one of the classes, one of the sessions I was giving this, who said, is that a typo? That doesn't make sense. You say that she's his manager, but he has more seniority. And I just said, oh, wow. You still live in a world where that is the only way to be a manager, I say. I told her, in 10 years, let's have some coffee. And then you tell me if you still think that that never happens and it's unrealistic, that your manager could possibly have less experience than you. I'm sure that's something that a lot of us have dealt with. And we may be in the situation that we have less experience than our direct reports. I know I've been in both of those situations. So Beth wanting to avoid confrontation, yes, that's all case data, but you have to decide what supports the story and what doesn't. So it can be tricky, but it's got to be there. And this is where you run the risk of giving too much or too little. All right, good. So other things to keep in mind, the guidance is down here at the bottom where it says to help Beth determine the right strategy. You could have easily just said, of these three options, select the best one. But this is teaching a behavior. Go back and review the list of communication strategies for a while until you get your footing. Don't just fly off the handle and say whatever you want to say. Think about it first. It's teaching a behavior rather than just giving them a bunch of multiple choice questions. And that's also a reflection opportunity where you can go and say, let me look at this list and see what I should be doing, as opposed to just winging it. Right. So it packed in these couple of sentences here is a lot. It's a lot. It's telling you about Beth's journey. It's telling you about the journey we want you to go on as a manager. And it's giving you opportunities to reflect and see what you need to do. 4, storytelling techniques. So in my book, I talk about 4 techniques that I think when built into your story make a lot of sense and can help bring it to life. The first one is this idea of connection. And when we think about that scenario, one good example of that is the way that we try to evoke empathy. The Beth cringes, the fact that we use dialogue, anything we can do to make you feel connected to the story rather than this person who's just hovering above 2 people talking. Anything we can do to foster that connection is important, and people try to do that in stories all the time. The other one is that is relevance. Obviously you can assume that this is going to new managers who are struggling with feedback, but you make it relevant by making sure the story is as authentic and true as possible, and having conversations so that it talks like them, that it's in their voice, and that it sounds like something that someone in their situation would be going through. Another one is change, right? So change is this idea of an evolution. Stories are about an evolution. Stories are about this journey that people go through. And when you look at Beth, there a change is coming. You don't see it yet, but the fact that she doesn't like confrontation and she's in the room and she stays in the room, and that eventually this is going to lead to a confrontation, that's a change in her. So any stories that where the protagonist goes through a change or a transformation, that's when you have a story. That's what separates a story from an anecdote. And finally, if you can be entertaining, that's great. Entertaining doesn't just mean funny. Entertaining can be tension. It can be mystery. It can be something that makes them think, I want to read more. I want to learn more. So these are the types of elements. Again, when you pull up that scenario, and I told you to put it in that table, you can consider these elements as well. How am I making sure that learners feel connected to this? How do they feel like it's relevant? What's the change that my protagonist is experiencing? And how can I get people interested in what's happening? Then lastly is the story spine. And the story spine is a great storytelling technique, and I love it, love it, love it, love it. I'm sure that the majority of you have heard of the hero's journey. And the hero's journey, if you haven't, there's lots and lots of information on it, but it's really basically the story or the path that the hero takes from a person in this ordinary world to hero. It's a lot of steps. It's a lot of work. Can't remember every one, but there are many, many people who have condensed it over the years. And this is one that I found that I love. And they actually use it in improv because it's so easy to remember. It's just the very short transformation of a person and what they've gone through. So I'll walk you through this. And there's a couple on my site, there's templates for this that you can use as well, another way. And I'll tell you about another way I use this. So first you begin with once upon a time. Now you don't say once upon a time is a question I often get. Of course not. However, you are trying to lay the ground for the ordinary world. What does the world look like today? So you introduce the characters, and I'm going to show you an example of this. So introduce the characters, you establish the current state or the ordinary world, so that people can recognize the change. And we know, for those of you who are instructional designers, know that we're always trying to find the current state so we can compare it to the desired state. And we know sometimes we can't get the current state. Sometimes it's difficult for people to articulate that because they haven't measured it, and they maybe don't want to be accountable for describing that current state. So it's not easy to get. So as much as you can, and I'll give you some ideas about that in a second here. Then you want to express what every day looks like. It's not just once upon a time it was this. We want to see what that behavior manifests as in this everyday world. And then you have an event, an incident. Something happens, an inciting event that's happened, is some sort of action that takes place that, boom, disrupts the ordinary world, right? It's that call to action. Something has occurred that makes you change or forces you to change. But you don't want to change. You want to stay the same. So that's why we have these series of because of that. As a result of this change, you're trying to restore balance. You're trying to get solutions to what's happening or create this brand new world. So people say, how many times do you say because of that? Well, first of all, what I like about because of that is it keeps you on a path, right? You don't meander all over the place. Every because of that is supposed to come as a direct result of the previous because of that, right? So it's all connected and everything feeds back up to the inciting incident, that event, right? So you frame these results as direct results and incidents of what happened, and you ensure that each one is a consequence of what came before it. And so finally, you have a climax. You have tried all of these different attempts to get the world back in order. What have you learned from all of that? And then ever since then, this is the change, right? So this is that journey. So let me give you a quick example of just what this would look like. So once upon a time, I'm going to move this out the way because I can't see anything. There we go. Give me just a second here. Let me put this back in the dock. There we go. So once upon a time, when I first began teaching instructional design, I thought it would be easy. So I knew the topic and I knew my people, right? Every day, I would tell stories about my experiences, often deviating from the content. I was being entertaining and real. I thought that's what they wanted. And one day I got the evaluations. They hated me. Now, of course, we know what we do. 20 people love you, one person hates you, and you're like, oh my God, I'm terrible. But, it was pretty much a consensus, I think I would have to say. They hated me. I learned that I came across as obnoxious, self consumed, and a braggart who, and this is the unkindest cut of all, thought she was funny. Oh my God, kills me. So what happened as a result of that? That was the inciting incident. That was the thing where I said, "Oh boy, something is amiss here. What is that interferes with how I see myself?" Because of that, I doubted everything. I became really self-conscious. I became consumed of what people thought of me. I thought I wasn't worthy of teaching these people. I'm not good enough to teach these people. So because of that self-consciousness, I tried on different personalities. I told fewer jokes. I tried only sticking to the content. No stories, more stories. I'm driving myself crazy. I felt like a fraud. And because of that, all of these machinations and changing personalities and all of that, my scores dropped or didn't change. Then finally, for my own sanity, I stopped focusing on myself and only focused on their experience. I remembered what I should have known all along, that this is about them. It's not about me. I had to take the focus off myself. And ever since then, my scores are way higher, and I would say not many more comments about being awful. And I decided to stop being the entertainer I thought they wanted and become the instructor that they deserved. Their progress is what made me feel worthy, right? So this is the full story. Now, when you are trying to break this up in scenarios, in between different parts, like after this one day part here, because of one day after this until I got the evaluations, you enter, this is one of the branches, one of the questions. What would you do in that situation? What's the next thing a person should do to get to course correct? What should happen next, right? Then down here after this, the scores didn't change. Now what do you do? What do you think happened? Reflect on what you just read. What disconnects are you seeing? So you know the full story, but when it comes to bringing it out in a scenario, you have all these different branches that you're introducing and questions every step of the way. But you need to know the full spine first. You need to know the full story first before you get into that. Now, I use this also as an interview technique. I have this as a template, and if I know if the story is not coming organically, I'm like, darn it, today I'm getting a story from this guy. And so I will make this into a template just like this, and I'll walk through it. And I don't show them the template, but when I want to know what the current state is, and they start talking about, well, what we want to get to, I go, no, 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 let's back up. I really need to know what is going on here, and what does that look like? Well, people don't know what they're doing. Well, I give me an example of what that looks like. What does that look like? Meanwhile, I'm just filling out this template. Them telling me people don't know what they're doing. That's once upon a time. What does that look like? Is every day, right? What could change to make all this better? What could change to wake people up? That's my but one day, right? So yeah, it's in you don't want to do it in a fictional way. You want to get an actual story. Tell me about how you became this fantastic manager, how you started delivering feedback really, really well. Tell me that and give me an example, and then you walk them through this so that you can have all these stories that you can go nuance later into scenarios. So it's a great tool. I definitely would look it up. There's many, there's a course on Khan Academy by Pixar, and it's all about storytelling, and they have a whole chapter on the story spine. I can't link directly to it for some reason, I guess because it's Pixar and Khan Academy, and I can't link directly to it, but it's a great example of how they use the story spine in Pixar movies. So all right, so in summary, first of all, the first step is use scenarios wisely. As I say, as long as there's people involved, you can use the scenario. They're always there. The question is, can you find them? Is it worth the work to find them? And whether or not you can make it as realistic as possible. Get the real story. Talk to people who are living this day to day and honor that story by feeling the awesome responsibility you have of going back and telling it to the world. But again, do that story sharing, build a rapport, reveal yourself so they'll feel comfortable revealing themselves. Use that scenario design model. As I mentioned, Ruth Clark has a whole book that is dedicated to that model. But it's a great way to at least check your scenarios to make sure it has what it needs to have. Use storytelling techniques, foster that connection, that relevance, that make sure that it's entertaining, that people want to stay engaged throughout, and that more importantly, it illustrates some sort of change. That's the whole point of stories. That's the point of movies. That's the point of all of this, is to show a change. We've seen it. Um, the fish out of water, the boy meets girl, good girl gone bad and good again. All these things that we've seen are all about change and journeys. And your stories and your scenarios are no different. And then use the story spine. Like I said, it's a wonderful tool. Even if you are presenting or if you are facilitating, no matter what role you're playing, if stories are involved, the story spine is a great way to structure your story so that it at least touches on maybe not the full hero's journey, but definitely transformation, which is what you're looking for. Okay, that is the end. That's it.